Hello, everybody, and thank you for attending the CFRA webinar today, Wednesday, March 26, 2020. Today, we'll be discussing a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, that being 5G, embarking on the next transformational shift in technology. Just a reminder, you can submit any questions that you have on the panel. A copy of the presentation is also in the handout section of the panel. So we have three presenters today. The first or a presenter is Keith Snyder. He's an equity analyst and our telecom specialist. You have Elizabeth Vermillion, who is an equity analyst, and she also covers the industrial space. And then finally, myself, Angelo Zeno. I cover the tech hardware and semiconductor industry. So as far as the agenda is concerned for this presentation, I'll start off by walking through a few slides about CFRA and just giving everyone a primer on 5G and what the excitement is all about. I'll then pass it over to Keith, who will then highlight the implications of 5G for the wireless carriers and tower providers. And then next, Elizabeth will look at 5G from a different perspective, offering her outlook on 5G as it pertains to the construction and engineering space. After that, I'll come back and I'll just talk about 5G from the lens of the hardware and semiconductor industry. And then finally, we'll use any remaining time to address questions from you, the audience. So CFRA delivers differentiated and actionable investment research across a range of services and solutions. We use a proprietary methodology that blends forensic accounting and fundamental equity research to enable investment professionals to analyze industries, funds, and companies of their interest. Our global subscribers include the world's leading institutional investors, wealth advisors, as well as corporations, academics, and governments. Through our fundamental research, we apply our unique, independent, and proprietary STARS research methodology to deliver long-term outperformance and differentiated idea generation. We also offer forensic accounting research, which is used by some of the leading institutional investors to identify risks that stem from discrepancies between reported financial results and a company or industry's true financial health. CFRA began 25 plus years ago as a forensic accounting focused research firm serving sophisticated institutional investor clients. In 2016, CFRA acquired the equity and fund research business from S&P Global. The equity and fund research business originated back in the 20s and has amassed a worldwide base of investing and clients. Today, CFRA is one of the world's largest independent research firms. The CFRA's proprietary methodology engine blends forensic and fundamental equity, ETF, and mutual fund research, analytics, and data approaches to deliver actionable research for improved investment and business decision-making. Research is conducted by 75 plus global analysts trained in fundamental and forensic insights and includes weekly market commentary, sector and industry research, company research, both qualitative and quantitative, ETF and mutual fund research, and tools for monitoring stocks and funds in your portfolio, model portfolios, as well as thematic research and thought leadership. So all that being said, now moving on to the reason why you're all dialed in today, 5G. What is it? So simply put, 5G, or the G in 5G, stands for generation, making 5G the fifth generation of cell connectivity intended to essentially enhance our wireless networks. So what's critical to understand is that the shift to 5G is not your typical hardware upgrade you get in your phone. It really is a new technology. And with that new technology, you get a ton of benefits. Many similar to the benefits that you saw from 3G to 4G. So you get those higher speeds, more efficient network, lower latency, which is essentially the buffering on your phone. However, the biggest benefit of 5G is that it'll be able to support billions of connected devices and things without a reduction in performance. So in fact, the whole concept, the idea of the whole Internet of Things, is where you have the need for everything around you to be connected. And that really can't become a reality until we upgrade our networks to 5G. So from a deployment perspective, we'll discuss this in depth, but we've seen global deployments really start taking place with China and the US really leading the charge. 5G also viewed to be the linchpin for many next generation technologies. Essentially the underlying infrastructure for AI in our view. You've heard all the hot words out there, AR, VR, edge computing, that all coincides with more AI capabilities. And then finally with 5G, it's important to note that not all 5G could or should be viewed the same. depending on the strategy of these wireless carriers as well as the hardware companies out there, the capability and benefits of 5G can really vary greatly. And we'll discuss all that here in a bit. So here's just a visual of the evolution of the wireless industry. I really try to illustrate where we came from and where we're going. So just a quick history lesson. 1G came about back in the early 80s. It's when you had those massive brick phones, but really great for those that remember it, as it gave us our first true mobile device. But really looking back, they were voice-only devices that had poor battery life and often came with dropped calls. Now, when you move to 2G, 2G came about in the early 90s and gave us the ability to text. 3G then emerged at the start of this century, finally gave us the ability to access the internet anywhere we went. 4G, which was released around 2008, 2009, and the primary standard still used today, gave us more power and a better ability to perform highly data-intensive capabilities on our mobile devices. So think about gaming services, you had the emergence of Apple's App Store, being able, probably most importantly, to stream the internet using videos that you find on Netflix, among other things. But 5G here won't necessarily give us anything new in terms of texting or making calls, browsing the internet, streaming video. But what it will do is improve all those features. And what 5G also does is it gives us, that is new, it is expected to really unlock a wave of new capabilities and technology applications in a host of new kind of addressable markets. And we'll also discuss that here in the coming slides. Now, in the next slide here, these are just some of the benefits of 5G and really looking at it from a peak performance perspective. So don't expect to get a 5G phone with 5G service and necessarily get these maximum benefits. I won't go through all these, but the need for a greater network efficiency is what is really driving the need for 5G investments. If you think about it really from a mobile data traffic perspective, the average person in 2018 used about 5 gigs of data per month. That number is expected to jump to about 24 gigs per month by 2024. So there's just a need for just more and more mobile data, and a current 4G network really can't support those needs. 5G also enables much lower levels of latency and the ability to kind of create much more secure levels of services. So from a technology perspective, not all 5G is the same. In fact, there are 3 different types of technology that wireless carriers are focusing on when upgrading their network. At the top of the cake here, you can see in the visual, you have something called high bandwidth millimeter wave. Actually, the first time the wireless industry has ever used this frequency, which is at the 24 gigahertz and above level. Benefits of millimeter wave is that you get the peak performance metrics I showed you on the last slide. The negatives is that you see there's limited supply at the moment, very costly, and the technology can be easily disrupted. Millimeter wave really most likely would be found initially in more dense urban areas. Next, you have the mid-band here, really your sweet spot when you get to where you get a good blend of performance and coverage. This will be the most popular option for carriers on a global basis. It uses existing spectrum today, anywhere from 1 to 6 gigahertz. And then finally, you have the low band, operates below 1 gigahertz, has great range, but very slow data transfer rates. So really expected to be only about 25 to 50% faster than 4G. And in fact, many consumers may not even be able to tell the difference between 4G and 5G in these type of areas. So what you'll see, we think, or what we expect to see is a mix of all this across the nation and globe, and much of the capabilities of 5G and timing of getting 5G in your area will likely depend on where you reside, whether it be urban, suburbs, or rural areas. Now, in terms of the cases of 5G, that can also really be defined into 3 categories, which is on the next slide. The first is the first column from your left. That's called enhanced mobile broadband. It'll be the first use of 5G, easiest to understand, essentially faster service and better coverage for all your internet connected devices, all your mobile devices. It's really the natural evolution from existing 4G networks. Gives you better experiences on your mobile device when using VR, AR, gaming, among other things. If you skip to the last column here, ultra reliable, low latency communications, also called mission critical communications. This is where the millimeter wave technology plays a big role that I highlighted on the last slide. These use cases focus on services that need to essentially deliver near zero error rates. So examples would include autonomous driving, factory automation, remote surgery, among other things. And then finally, you have that middle column, which is massive machine type communications. Here you have fully autonomic and automatic and intelligent machines, essentially with no human or little human intervention. These type of communications aren't mission critical in nature, but they do need to be constantly connected to the network. So they can be done at much lower bandwidths, but they do require a lot of power efficiency as they always need to be connected. So the best examples of these machine type communications, think about smart buildings, smart homes, your smart grids and utilities, your smart health monitors. Really, we believe the opportunity for 5G to open up these new addressable markets over the next few years. So, in slide 14 here, just a slide of 5G deployments we have seen thus far from some of the biggest regions. Korea, thanks to the help of Samsung, was really the first region to launch commercial service of 5G from their big three carriers, and that momentum has been very good, further increasing the excitement here for 5G. But that being said, China and the US are believed to be the main drivers of 5G from a connections basis here over the next 3 years, while Europe at the moment appears to be lagging. This compares to 4G when it was the US, which was the clear driver to adoption, and 3G when it was actually Europe that was the leader. That said, we have seen some push-outs as of late, mainly in China, and the coronavirus situation definitely not helping the matter at this time. Still, we would expect the rollout of 5G to be steeper than 5G initially, because you do have China as a big participant so early in the game this time, and you didn't necessarily have that with 4G. Now, on page 15, the chart on the left here just shows projected 5G connections by region. Important to note that it represents service connections and not 5G devices sold. You'll have a lot more 5G devices sold that may not be connected to a 5G service, and I'll discuss that at a later point. As far as connections are concerned, though, we go essentially from near zero in 2019 to 1 billion in 2023. And then on the right-hand chart here, just shows you the market share of global installations by region. Not surprisingly, Asia really dominates, more due to the law of numbers, right? A lot more people live in Asia than anywhere else in the world. And with that, I'll kind of leave it at that. That's really a quick primer on 5G. At this point now, I'll just pass it over to Keith, who will dig more into the implications of 5G for the wireless carriers and tower operators. Keith?
Great, thanks, Angelo. So I guess first off, I'm going to just do a quick overview of current networks in the U.S. So starting with Verizon, this is basically their coverage area. They are starting obviously in urban centers. They're focusing very heavily on the millimeter wave spectrum. They use the 28 gigahertz spectrum for their 5G network. And if you look at it, in the next slide, when we get there, we'll see kind of the drawbacks of this. But coverage is a big problem for them just because of propagation issues with millimeter wave. They're hoping to eventually get around this with a technology called dynamic spectrum sharing, which they're currently developing with Ericsson, which essentially would allow them to, on the fly, switch spectrum between 4G and 5G based on where the need is. So moving to the next slide. So here we can just see this is their coverage. On the left, this is what they're stating their New York City coverage is. But then on the right, when you actually zoom into some of these areas, you're looking at coverage area of 2 blocks in some cases. And so really the problem with their network right now is, if you're one of the lucky people who splurged on a $1,300 phone that supports 5G, you really only get it in a very limited space within the city. And even with that being said, there's been a bunch of reports of, coverage working on one side of the street, but being completely dead on the other side of the street. So, their focus on millimeter wave, they're definitely going to have a fast network, but coverage is going to be a huge issue for them moving forward. Moving on, we'll just take a quick look at AT&T. Sorry, this map's kind of hard to read, but basically AT&T's strategy has been they've separated their network into 3 categories, essentially. They rolled out what they called the 5G Plus network back in the end of 2018. And that was a millimeter wave spectrum offering. It only was available to businesses. And to use it, it required an access point. So you needed to buy a piece of hardware that could connect to the network. So really, it was just for fixed wireless broadband. Now moving forward, they're shifting a focus to what they're calling just 5G, which is going to be the sub 6 gig, 850 megahertz spectrum. So this is what they're going to use for their coast to coast coverage. It's going to be what their consumer network runs on. And they've just started rolling that out. Actually, the first few cities came out this month. And then, they had what they call 5GE or 5G evolution. And that really was a marketing stunt. It was essentially a rebranding of their existing 4G LTE network. They faced a lawsuit for, false advertising. It's just 4G. So now looking at T-Mobile, they're claiming first 5G nationwide network. Their network covers about 200 million people. It uses the low band, so it uses their 600 megahertz spectrum. So as Angela alluded to earlier, these low bands, they're great for propagation, so you can cover a very wide area with them. But in terms of speed, most of the reports coming out are saying that it's only moderately faster than their existing LTE network. With that said, now that the Sprint T-Mobile merger has been approved, T-Mobile is going to move very quickly to start deploying Sprint's 2.5 gigahertz spectrum across its urban areas to really build in a more dense coverage layer, and that's going to be where you're going to see the really fast network speeds. Just that mid-band spectrum is the perfect mix of propagation and speed. And then finally, looking at Sprint, they have a very, very limited network. They use their 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. At least from our point of view, they've kind of held back on new deployments just, with the merger, with them seeking approval for the merger. I think their focus actually was on making themselves seem in a weaker position. So, part of the reason they wanted this merger to go through was, they were claiming they wouldn't be able to survive. So we think they basically passed on new deployments and waited for the merger to be approved. Now, finally, just to sum up their strategies, AT&T is mixing the spectrum that they use. Verizon focused on the millimeter wave coverage with the possibility of repurposing older spectrum. T-Mobile using low band, but now with the merger of Sprint, they're going to get access to a lot of millimeter wave and mid-band spectrum, and they'll move very, very quickly to deploy that. Part of their approval was they agreed to cover 97% of the US population with a 5G network in the first 3 years of closing the deal. So to make good on that, they're going to have to move very quickly. And then Sprint, their strategy, at least from our point of view, was to survive long enough to merge. They didn't have the financial flexibility without the merger to really deploy a network at the same speed as the other players in the market. So now on the next slide, from our point of view, looking ahead, we think the new T-Mobile is going to be in the best position of the US carriers for 5G. The spectrum that they're going to possess is perfectly fit for 5G. They have a lot of mid-band spectrum. They're going to be able to deploy millimeter wave in some cases where it's needed, and then for the coverage area, they'll just use the low band. AT&T, they also have a good mix, but we think that they're the need that they have not only to build out their network, but they're also spending very heavily on Time Warner, new content. They're rolling out their HBO Max streaming service later. They really aren't able to focus exclusively on their network, which is a disadvantage from our point of view. And then Verizon, we think, is in the worst position. They're focused on millimeter wave. The speeds look great, but again, if you're on the right street corner, they look great. And so we think that's going to hamper their development moving forward. Up next, we think this slide is kind of an interesting look at the adoption rate. So looking back to the 4G, the coverage area and then obviously retail adoption lag each other. So it's usually 1.5 to 2 year lag between when coverage is available and when someone actually adopts technology, with peak adoption occurring more like 3 or 4 years after peak coverage. We expect 5G to basically progress at the same rate. Right now, the major drawbacks, and there's not many devices. The devices that are available are incredibly expensive, and then very limited coverage area. But we note that Apple is planning on launching a 5G phone at some point. That's going to be huge for consumer adoption. And then just as more and more build out occurs, it'll become consumers will see the benefit of switching over to 5G once they're able to actually access the network. Up next, I'm just going to quickly cover tower operators. And so on the first slide here, these are the two main antenna types. So we have traditional towers, which is when you think of a cell tower, you're thinking of the traditional macro site. They're great for widespread coverage. Typically, a tower will house more than one operator, but with 5G's reliance on millimeter wave and the mid-band spectrum and the propagation issues associated with them, a lot of companies are going to turn to small cells. So these are little baby devices. They put them on street poles. They put them on the sides of buildings. They can be under benches. Basically, they're building a more dense network by using these low-powered antennas. These antennas usually support, as few as 30 people, but they can support up to, 1,500 to 2,000 people. And so you'll start to see those in areas like stadiums. Anywhere where you need really dense network coverage is, going to be where small cells excel. And so, you're just going to see this exponential small cell deployment growth as networks start to roll out. And then finally, looking just at the tower operators themselves, on page 27, these are the three under our coverage. American Tower, the largest by far, with heavy exposure to international markets. SBAC is your mix between international and US. And so especially with international, we really like any company that has international exposure. Just because 5G being the big topic in the US, a lot of the developing countries are still rolling out 4G and 4G LTE. If you look at places like South America, India, they're actually being more aggressive with network deployments than the US is, especially India, who they want part of their development plan is getting as many people access to the internet as possible, and they've chosen cell or mobile service over fixed service to accomplish that. In the middle we have Crown Castle. The interesting thing about these, so they're heavily focused on small cells, and then also they have a very strong fiber holdings. And this is pretty important just because as you deploy these small cells, you have to connect them to a network somehow. Each cell needs its own connection, and so fiber really comes into play here to handle not only just the sheer number of cells, but also the data traffic on them. So the fiber is going to handle all your data backhaul, and just their holdings there are pretty robust. And then they have been investing quite heavily in the small cell side. And right now there's more demand than they can supply. The lag time, just with regulatory approval, city and municipal approval, slows things down. It takes about 18 months from initial deployment to actually getting a cell online. So that's been their main holdback right here. But yeah, so these three are the main beneficiaries from 5G deployments, just from the tower infrastructure side of things. And so now with that, I'm going to turn it back to Angelo.
All right, thanks a lot, Keith. So I guess, with that being said, we're going to, now turn it over, or kind of switch it over a little bit, where, a lot of the talk around 5G investments and infrastructure build-outs really have historically focused on the wireless carriers and a host of industries inside the tech sector, so think semis and comm equipment. But what we want to do right now is kind of highlight an industry that we think many people overlook when thinking about the transition to 5G, and that being the construction and engineering space. And to do that, I'll actually pass the baton over now to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Angelo. So moving on to slide 29. Construction and engineering companies play a vital role in the infrastructure build-out required for the 5G network. We see a really strong potential for construction and engineering companies to benefit in both the near term and the long term. And we think that this is really something that a lot of people haven't considered, as Angelo mentioned. So right now, the US and many other countries across the world do not have the necessary fiber density in access networks for the bandwidth advancements that are needed for 5G. And so that's where these companies are coming in. They offer services like design, permitting, material procurement, power coordination, tower construction, antenna installation. And so all of this is really necessary for the build out and for these carriers that have been mentioned earlier to further expand their networks. And then also we want to highlight that after the initial build out, the construction engineering names can kind of stay in the game by providing network maintenance. So these towers will need maintenance, whether it be from weather damage and stuff like that. So that's how they'll kind of keep their foot in the 5G game. Moving on to slide 30. Yep. So this is just a highlight of the construction and engineering sub-industry. It's a relatively small sub-industry within the S&P 1500 industrial sector. As you can see, it just makes up about 1% of total sector based on market cap. Market cap for the construction engineering sector sub-industry is about 32 billion. And then so as of yesterday, the sub-industry is actually trading down 9.5%. But if you look at the companies that we see as exposed to 5G, they're only down 3.5%. So moving on to slide 31. The change from 4G and 4G LTE to 5G is a lot larger than any of the prior network transitions. Significant fiber expansion is required. And this is in rural and urban areas. And actually, the build out in urban areas, one might think, might be smaller than in rural areas, but really it's at least as significant, if not more build out is needed. As Keith mentioned, with the small cell framework, there's a lot more build out that they're going to need to do to get through building walls. Stuff like that is actually a pretty strong hindrance to 5G. So the build out in both rural and urban areas is pretty expansive. So there's thousands of additional touch points that need to be built. That means that there's going to be a lot more fiber that needs to be installed, more utility poles, more electrical infrastructure. And so that's where these construction engineering companies really need to lay the groundwork for carriers and everybody to come in behind them. So taking a look at some of the numbers for the 5G build out, right now we estimate that there is an 5G infrastructure spending increase needed of $26 billion by 2022 from about $538 million in 2018. This is compound annual growth rate of 118%. The US really wants to lead the world in the transition to 5G, but as we've mentioned before, they're really lacking the necessary fiber and infrastructure close to the end customers. In North America, we estimate that there is 130 billion to 150 billion of fiber infrastructure needed, and that's over the next 5 to 7 years to support broadband competition, coverage in rural areas, and then wireless densification, especially in these urban areas. In the US, a lot of this investment is actually going to be private sector driven. So a federal infrastructure plan or something like that is really, the 5G bill is not contingent on that. So we see that as a positive that the US can move forward with 5G spending with or without a federal infrastructure spending plan. And so North America operators are going to continue to progress pretty slowly with their 5G build out. The routing market is expected to expand at about 2.4% compound annual growth rate between 2018 and 2023. The EMEA region, so that's Europe, Middle East, and Africa, is expected to have a pretty similar growth rate as North America at about 2.5%. And in line with what Angelo spoke about earlier, the Asia Pacific market is expected to grow at a much stronger compound growth rate of 5.2% in that same time frame. So then we're just going to conclude by highlighting a few of the construction and engineering companies where we see the most near-term and long-term growth potential from the 5G build-out. So the companies that we like the most are Jacobs Engineering, MozTech, and Quanta. So we have a buy on both Jacobs and Quanta, and we see that their exposure to 5G is very strong in some of their dominating segments. They are doing a lot of the fiber build out. They're doing a lot of the necessary work for the towers and everything to be built. So we see that is something that's an immediate catalyst, and then it's also going to be something that's really going to help them drive growth in the next few years. And of course, as 5G begins to accelerate, we see their benefits from the build out accelerating. And with that, I will pass it back to Angelo.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Elizabeth. So, with all that being said, I guess, we'll shift gears again here, and, I'll take the lead and talk about kind of the mobile 5G market and, how it pertains to the hardware as well as semiconductor industries. So, if we start kind of looking at, the real opportunity on 5G in the absolute near term, it's clearly on the mobile side of things and smartphones, right? For those of you that listened to our annual predictions piece here back in January, the next two slides are really going to kind of recap some of those assumptions with some updates, of course, because of the coronavirus situation, but a little bit more in detail than what we spoke about back in January. When you think about the benefits of 5G, again, clearly going to be seen on the mobile side of things than anywhere else. And I think that should be apparent given, after we discuss some of the capabilities of 5G, where many of the future cases we talked about are likely, 3 to 5 years or even further out. So smartphones, if you think about it, have really begun looking like traditional dinosaur tech markets as of late, now down 3 years in a row. Looking at the smartphone market in 2019, had about 1.4 annual units sold. Last year, in terms of 5G smartphones, about 50 million units. And that was all led by Samsung and Huawei, as they kind of were the initial players in the market. And then you also saw a slew of China players in the fourth quarter. Now, that being said, we estimate 5G phones will nearly quadruple to about 200 million in 2020, and albeit, we're talking about a low base of 50 million in 2019. But in 2020, we think 5G phones will represent about 14% of the smartphone market. A key driver this year is obviously going to be Apple this fall as they transition all their next-gen phones to 5G, as long as, the coronavirus doesn't kind of cause any issues to that. In 2021, you get a full year of Apple devices, and you get greater consumer awareness, we think. And then by 2022, you've got a host of low-price 5G devices entering the market from China. So that being said, by 2022, we expect about 40% of phones to be 5G enabled, and we think there's probably a lot of upside to that number. The net effect in terms of smartphone sales, in our view, we're looking at about 1% growth now in 2020. And clearly, a lot of the challenges in the first quarter are going to hinder the growth number, which is why we're only looking for 1% growth. And then we're looking for about 3 to 5% in 2021. Not great, but not declining anymore, which should be a good sign for the market. And quite honestly, again, the coronavirus situation needs to be taken into account and probably pushes out a number of 5G launches a few months out. This week is actually when we typically get the biggest hardware semiconductor event of the year, that being Mobile World Congress, an event which has been canceled or was canceled, where we expected the entire event to really be focused on 5G with tons of new product announcements to be announced. And given it didn't take place, we do think a lot of these product announcements probably get pushed out about 6 to 8 weeks. Now going to the next slide, slide 36. The illustration here just looks at our outlook on pricing for smartphones for both iPhones and the Android installed base. 5G initially will push prices higher because they just naturally cost more, right? Costs for 5G phones vary greatly, mainly due to the disparity on the type of chips going into these smartphones. So we earlier discussed the different types of 5G from high end to mid to low band. the types of components hardware manufacturers want to put in these phones will of course dictate the prices of many of these devices. So again, all eyes we think will be on Apple and how they handle a 5G launch this fall, as everyone typically follows their lead. Clearly, Apple wants to limit any price hike, but they also want to prevent any type of confusion to the consumer by rolling out different tiered phones with different 5G capabilities. So we think Apple could actually look to do a number of things here, but with 5G, my guess is that they looked at 5G launches from more of a geographic perspective. So for instance, in the US, Verizon offers millimeter wave capabilities, so Apple probably wants that capability in their phones here in the US, but may not be as relevant to do so in India and other emerging markets where that technology won't be available or used. So, again, 2020, most 5G phones will be higher end in nature, resulting in a better mix of higher priced phones being sold. In 2021 and thereafter, some of the cheaper phones enter the market. So those higher selling prices we're seeing this year rolls over a little bit next year. But what's important to note, though, on the Apple side, we do expect selling prices to continue to increase both in 2020 and 2021 due to the full year mix of 5G next year. And then, remain relatively stable thereafter. Now, going to the next slide here, not much to talk about here, but just gives you an idea of who the potential buyers of a 5G service would be initially. So early adopters, based on a survey done, skews towards higher income people. 1/3 willing to buy, make over 75K, and 20% make six figures. Early adopters would be geared more towards millennials that spend a lot of time streaming videos and games, where 5G will offer higher value to the consumer. And note that about 2/3 would only buy a 5G plan if the service costs $10 or less. Verizon initially, when they rolled out 5G, it was for $10, where T-Mobile was essentially giving it away for no additional charges. 5G networks, as Keith alluded to, for both are very different. With Verizon's initiatives a little bit more, clearly capital intensive in nature. And then finally, important to note that Apple's installed base should be perceived as a lot more, or is perceived as a lot more affluent and caters to many of the attributes that a lot of early adopters of 5G would be looking for. And for that reason, we do think Apple will see a lot of success in terms of 5G. Now moving on to slide 38, I just want to kind of use the next few slides just to look at some of the component players and who would be the biggest beneficiaries of a broader 5G adoption, right? So this is just a teardown of the most recent iPhone 11 Max phone. And, the iPhone 11 Max costs about $500 to make. The biggest cost you can see here is the display. It's about 17% of the cost. You've got the camera at about 15%. And then the application processor, which is, their A13 processor, is about 13%. Thereafter, you've got, the flash, which is essentially the memory used to store your photos and videos. That's about 80% of the cost here. But if you look at where my focus here, it's on those two arrows, which is highlighted on the RF component makers and the baseband processors, which make up 6% and 5% of the total cost at the moment. So in I guess the most simplest form, a baseband processor is basically a device or a chip that manages all the radio functions in a device. So the baseband processor handles the cellular transmission. Think of it as acting as a digital interface, as it basically converts the data to a signal that can be used to the carrier and vice versa. Now the RF chip actually transmits and receives the radio waves that are found in essentially anything that needs connectivity, not only cell phones, but also the base stations, the satellite transceivers, wireless routers, everything. So both critical components of a device. As far as 5G is concerned, this is all about connectivity, right? So while all component makers inside a phone just benefit from stable to higher volume of phones sold, the companies that really see the biggest step up in demand are the ones that are going to see the biggest boost in content per device. And that falls squarely on the manufacturers that make the RF components like Skyworks, Broadcom, and Qorvo, as well as the baseband processor players like Qualcomm being really the 800-pound gorilla here. So big takeaway here on this slide, RF and baseband processors will see the biggest content boost on both the phone side as well as the infrastructure side of things. And they really have a lot of staying power here in terms of 5G and benefits. Going to the next slide here, this is just a slide of the top chip makers in the mobile phone market. Important to note that the market share numbers really exclude the memory and display guys, as it would skew these numbers heavily. This pie chart really more focused on some of the connectivity players out there. It's why you have only a 4% share for Samsung, where for all intents and purposes, Samsung has more revenue dollars inside an iPhone than any other company out there. You can see the big player, not surprisingly here, outside of those companies is Qualcomm with 33% of the market. And that's poised to go up both in here in 2020 and 21 as 5G ramps. Intel at 6% just sold its modem business to Apple. So that business essentially is going to Qualcomm here over the next 2 years before Apple tries to probably start making its own chips and slowly takes Qualcomm out of the picture again. You have MediaTek and HiSilicon. They both compete with Qualcomm on the baseband side of things. HiSilicon is a semiconductor subsidiary of Huawei, for those that don't know. They've been enforced to make as many components in-house as possible after the U.S. placed its ban on Huawei goods last year. And we actually believe that they're about 90% self-sufficient at this time. After Qualcomm, you can see many of the RF players on this list. You've got Broadcom, Skyworks, and Qorvo. And if you're interested, Apple on this list because they internally design their own application processors that are manufactured by Taiwan Semiconductor, so that A13 chip. Now going on to the next slide here. So we kind of talked about, the companies that will benefit from the content gains. This is more of a visual of what you need to know. This is just a visual of the RF companies from the migration from 2G to 3, 4, and 5G. So in a 4G phone, the average RF content per phone was only $3. That number then jumped all the way up to $18 by the time you got to a 4G phone, and it's expected to reach $25 in a 5G device. So, for these players, again, it's not about higher mobile device volume and the whole evolution of the Internet of Things. Although all that kind of helps out with the movement to 5G, but it's really all of those extra components needed inside of a device to improve the connectivity of these devices. And that's why we love the business prospects for these companies so much. Now going on to slide 41. This is just an important slide to me, and a very important slide. We've got a lot of hype on 5G. It's gotten to extreme levels, and I think it's important for investors to really be careful at this point in time. In terms of the semiconductor market in 2019, we had a situation where you had essentially a rising tide lifting all boats scenario. I would tell everyone walking away from this that the names that will have, again, the most staying power in terms of 5G are the content takers that we highlight, and we highlighted who they are already. Also important, while most people would think the infrastructure plays will be the biggest or initial biggest beneficiaries of 5G, that's not necessarily true, at least as it pertains to the semiconductor industry. In fact, if we look at the 4G ramp 7 years after launch, and this being 4G again, about 90% of phones were 4G enabled 7 years after launch, but less than half of the global population was connected to a 4G service. Now, with 5G, we think that's going to happen again. We alluded to the fact that, we think 40% of smartphones sold by 2023 will be 5G enabled. But at that point, we think, only about 10% or less than that will have mobile connections to a 5G service. Why? Well, hardware companies like Apple will lead the way in offering the service, but the wireless carriers across the globe will be much slower in upgrading these networks, especially in more emerging markets. So I think the chart here on the right really does a good job of looking at the semiconductor opportunity, comparing the mobile side versus the infrastructure side. And you can see that initially it was, a lot very much infrastructure related, but that stabilizes here while the mobile opportunity for 5G really takes off. Now on the next slide here, this is just kind of a quick list of names that we think should benefit or more kind of, gravitated towards the 5G side of things. Whether mobile or infrastructure related. But I really wanted to highlight here is how many of these chip makers, at one point did appear very expensive because of the move they had in 2020. And when you kind of look at the multiples on a 2020 basis. But when you kind of start looking at the 2021 expectations, you can see how these companies really grow into the multiple. And in fact, when looking at it from historical levels, the average group of these stocks now really not trading far off their 5-year average, and actually many of them are actually trading below their historical average, and you can kind of thank the market disruption we saw here over the last couple of days for that. So we do see a lot of opportunities in terms of the chip market here, but clearly need to be selective. Now, on the next slide here, while most of the discussion on 5G today really has centered around the opportunities over the next 3 years, again, which will come on both the mobile infrastructure side of things, the future of 5G really has the opportunity to redefine many of our industries, right? Some of the examples here shown on the slide, and it expands the long-term addressable market for many companies that we highlighted. But that said, they are very much futuristic in nature, 3 to 5 years out, and in reality, you may not see some of them again, really gain steam until 6G ramps up in a decade from now. So I thought it was kind of a good way to end it that way. That's really all we had for the prepared side of things. What I'll do now is just kind of open it up for any questions. We do have a couple here, so I'll start off with maybe a question for Keith here. I've heard talk about health concerns associated with 5G. Is there a health risk associated with the large number of small cells being deployed out there?
Yeah, so this has been discussed quite a bit, and what it comes down to is when you think about radiation in general, so obviously the spectrum they're using is high band stuff mostly, but it's not all radiation the same. You have ionizing radiation, which is think Chernobyl. That's the really, really deadly stuff, and then you have non-ionizing radiation, which is cell frequencies. So the science would say no, but there has been a lot of chatter and a lot of the a lot of people who really think that there's health risks. They quote one of the most quoted studies from the Department of Health and Human Services, which looked at 3G transmissions. What they say is the study did find that they linked exposure to some tumors that developed. But looking at the actual numbers, and what they don't quote from this study was that the number of tumors that they found in their test subjects was actually so low that it could have just been statistically by chance that these people had tumors develop. So there was nothing statistically significant about their findings. That being said, there are a number of studies that are still going on, but there really isn't much of a health concern, just given the nature of the spectrum being used. Despite there being more transmitters out there, they're still fairly low power. So the short answer is no, there's really not a health concern that 5G brings up.
Okay, great. And I'm just actually going to give you one more here in terms of the carrier side of things. There's a question being asked on which carriers have the most bandwidth licenses to be able to maximize 5G home and business internet versus just mobile devices.
So I mean, if you're talking about like what we call fixed wireless access, which you use a 5G network to get internet broadband in the home or business. Right now, Sprint or Verizon and T-Mobile or Verizon and AT&T are the only ones offering this in a very small number of markets with millimeter wave. Long term, it's going to be Sprint T-Mobile. So the exciting thing about the fixed wireless access side of things is that it's going to be great for rural coverage. Urban areas are very dense in fiber and wired connections, so there's no real benefit there. But given what AT&T or what Sprint to T-Mobile agreed to with the FCC for approval, those build-out requirements, 97% in the first 3 years. They also need to be covering 80% of rural populations in 3 years with a 5G network, and so we think that those outside build-outs, to offer home broadband with 5G, it's a great use case for that area. And so, we think Sprint and T-Mobile realistically are best positioned, at least from a network standpoint, to benefit from demand for fixed wireless access, which, at the end of the day is going to be a very small subset of connections. But the areas that they target are perfectly suited for that kind of access.
Okay, great. So another question here in terms of maybe for you, Elizabeth, how would a federal infrastructure spending plan in the U.S. impact the 5G build-out taking place?
So touched on that a little bit during my slides, but most of the spending for U.S. on the 5G build-out, especially on the infrastructure side, is expected to be privately funded. A small percentage might be from state and local government funding, and so that's actually an area where funding across the industrial space has been really supportive of growth in the last year, and we expect that to continue going forward. So a federal infrastructure plan really wouldn't change the funding all that much that's going towards 5G. It might benefit some of these construction and engineering companies a little bit, but that's one of the benefits that we see. And one of the reasons that we really like some of the companies in this space is they are not dependent on that infrastructure plan, which, was something that seemed like it was going to get passed maybe earlier in 2018, but since then has definitely been put to the back burner. It's possible that it will come up again towards the end of 2020 and we could see a plan in 2021, but at this point, it's not something that these companies are anticipating or expecting when they book out their future work. So the private funding is really what's driving the infrastructure spending for the construction engineering companies.
Okay, great. So, I guess the next question here, I'll take first. I don't know if anyone else kind of wants to jump in after me, but I'll take this on. In terms of what impact do you see the coronavirus having on a 5G ramp? As far as for the hardware and semiconductor markets are concerned here, our view is, and I guess you can look at it in two ways, one from a supply side of things, right, and the other from a demand side of things. In terms of the supply side of things, we've clearly seen some supply disruption because there are a whole bunch of components that are made out in China, of course. And that being said, our view is, you've clearly seen a disruption in supply. We do think that as long as, and more so for Apple, as long as we can kind of get this thing under terms come May or June, the latest, it won't have an issue as far as kind of the 5G ramp for Apple is concerned, and that's really kind of what everybody is looking at the moment. As far as are there some supply constraints at the moment in terms of producing these iPhones? Sure, but we do think a lot of that missed revenue opportunity really gets pushed out, and the same goes for many of these chip makers. If they're not necessarily pumping some of these chips out today, we do think there's it'll result in a more steeper ramp as we kind of go into the spring and summer months, as long as the coronavirus situation is somewhat contained. I'd say the bigger concern we have in terms of the situation is more on the demand side in the immediate term. You can kind of look at what's going on in the smartphone side of things, and it's, even on a GDP side of things in terms of China, where essentially many people are now calling for no growth in terms of GDP for China in Q1. We do think there's going to be a huge decline in smartphone sales in Q1 in China. I wouldn't be surprised to see something at least down 10 to 20% and potentially more in terms of the smartphone market. But again, I think there was a lot of concern, especially on the Apple side of things, where maybe they were almost kind of doing too well on the iPhone 11, when it might have costed them on the 5G side of things. If anything, we do think there's a greater opportunity come the second half of this year again. But that being said, I think it's a very fluid situation, and it's something that we need to kind of continue to keep an eye on. And I don't know, Keith or Elizabeth, if either of you want to kind of jump in on your end.
Yeah, sure. So, from telecom, we don't really see it affecting adoption at all. At this point, the inhibitors to adoption have been extreme limited availability of network coverage, and then the limited availability of phones, not necessarily from a manufacturing capacity standpoint, but rather the market for $1,500 phones isn't huge. So we'll wait to see, again, as Angela alluded to, if the 5G iPhone is delayed, that could push back adoption. But the way we see it right now is that these companies are proceeding as business as usual right now in terms of their deployments.
Okay, great. All right, so here's another one for Keith, maybe. Do you think consumer 5G will be able to live up to all the hype?
Short answer is no. With any new technology, hype tends to run ahead of the actual delivery of services. I do think that from an enterprise business, manufacturing perspective, there's a lot of really cool things with 5G that will completely revolutionize the way we think about automation, monitoring, with the low latency connections, the basically real time processing of data. There's a lot of cool applications there, but it's right now for consumers, it's more noise. The ads on TV are completely inundated with AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile, screaming about their 5G networks. But as we've seen, they're still in the very early stages of deployment. So at the end of the day, I think consumers will see some benefits, but we're not talking about life-altering things that occur with 5G. Okay,
great. And maybe I'll leave this last one off to Elizabeth here. Is there anything that could delay the infrastructure, work, construction, and engineering companies and what they need to do?
So really the only thing that would cause significant delays would be permitting issues. We see that potentially a little bit more likely in the U.S. in some of the more rural areas. Permitting issues are pretty unlikely in some of the more urban areas, but that would be the main thing that would cause any pushback. And again, that would most likely be near term, maybe at the longest a medium term headwind, but it would definitely not be detrimental to the long-term build out.
Okay, great. So I'll leave it at that. So I hope everyone enjoyed the content today. If so, feel free to join us for our next webinar. Details on recent and upcoming webinars can be found on our website, www.cfraresearch.com. You can also visit advisor.marketscope.com for more information on the research presented today. And with that, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Take care.